So we're going to talk about the human technology frontier. I've been on the CCC Council 4 years now. So I'm starting my new 3-year rotation. I enjoyed it so much that I decided to do it again. For the first couple of years, I was really focused on some of the work around IoT, security and IoT. Since the last 2 years, I've been co-chairing the Human Technology Frontier Task Force. So the task force are a subset of us within the council that focus on a particular topic area, and the Human Technology Frontier has been one of them. And this is an area that's fairly, there's many different ways to define it. And so you'll see that we have a lot of different activities in this area that we've lumped under HTF. But before we go into the specific areas, I want to talk a little bit about what is the human technology frontier. Like many of you, when I first heard of the term, it was fairly nebulous, and it still is often nebulous depending on who you talk to about it. I mean, in a way, you can really think about this as an offshoot of human-computer interaction, but really, I think it's much more broader than that. So what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about HTF, kind of what the thoughts is around it in terms of the community, how we define it, and then we'll talk about 3 different areas of exploration within the CCC that we're looking at. So I'll briefly talk about mobile health and digital health. It's one of the newer areas that we're focusing on in a particular area around stress, mental health, addiction. I'll briefly talk about that, and then then hand it over to Dan, who's going to talk about intellectual infrastructure, and then Beth is going to talk a little bit about the aging work and also some of the workforce training work. And then we'll probably tag team as we talk about the various areas. So HTF, Human Technology Frontier, this term and this concept actually came out of a 2016-2017 NSF working group that actually included a number of different folks from a set of different directorates, so including SCIS, ENG, EHR, SPE, looking at there's recognizing the fact that there is this change in how the workforce and how people are actually working and how people are going to be trained, given the context of technology and where technology is going. So with advancements in AI, you often hear about these things that AI is taking over the industry. People are not going to have jobs anymore. It's really taking a different lens on that and saying that, well, what are the opportunities there with the advancement in technology and workforce changing in general? So it really had a little bit more of a workforce influence on it. So looking at how we think about technology and that symbiosis relationship with people in terms of how we think about research topics in this area. So advancements in robotics and IoT all play a role in this. Although a lot of the initial thoughts around this space have been really motivated around workplace, we actually think of it as in a broader sense, where we actually think of it the broader idea of the social technical considerations, where it's really the technology and the human and the various things around that. So it's the technology, it's how technology augment people augment technology, vice versa. So it's looking at the broader landscape of things, which actually include things more than just the workforce. The things that underpin that are health, people's health, safety, looking at the physical infrastructure itself, looking at how the infrastructure is going to evolve over time to support this future. And so those are the areas we'll kind of touch on today. So some of the areas, so what is HTF? So some of the things that this working group came up with and kind of in the community what we've been looking at is, here's some examples. One is understanding and building the human technology partnership. So you can think about manufacturing cobots, like looking at robotics, where it's not just the robot doing its own thing in terms of building a car. It's really this combination of robots and humans controlling those things. There's some things that robots are really good at with repetitive processes where humans actually can come in and interview for quality inspections and those kinds of things. And also looking at 3D VR environments where there's also, with VR, you can actually, be able to investigate a scene or something in multiple different dimensions, but you still need the human in the loop to be able to facilitate that. So looking at that partnership, where you've probably seen a lot of this stuff in the HCI communities, but really amplifying it to the point where it's actually embedded in the real world all around us. The other is augmenting human performance. So these are things like exoskeletons for strength and rehabilitation. The military has been looking at exoskeletons. So how do you enhance human performance? And looking at prosthetic arms and those kinds of things. Even deep neural nets where a human could probably identify where that tumor is, but if you look at it with a neural net algorithm identifying a region where you might have missed and putting your attention in that location, you might find something that you may have otherwise missed with visual inspection, for example. And so those are just some areas of kind of what we think about in HTF or Human Technology Frontier. But the other areas that we're exploring within actually this is a little bit out of order. So the other area is lifelong learning. So this is something that there's actually There's already an NSF call on this, which is learning in the workforce. There's an NSF call around looking at how do we think about the HTF relationship in lifelong learning. So fostering lifelong learning, looking at how you learn with technology, so the role that VR could play in simulation, and looking at how we can use technology to help train individuals in this emerging new workforce as well. So the areas that we've been exploring has been in the CCC within our task force and others is looking at this lifelong learning, which Beth will talk a little bit more about in terms of what we're doing there. Another area in mobile and digital health, and I'll talk about that in a second. Dan will talk about intelligent infrastructure, so looking at how do we actually make sure that the infrastructure is in place for a lot of these things that we're doing. And there's already a series of white papers that we've been publishing in that space. And related to that is aging in place and how the role that AI is going to play. And then in the health care space, if you think about the broader socio-technical impact of that, reducing disparities, in particular, think about health disparities, right, across the United States. So these are the topic areas that we've explored within the CCC. So I'll talk briefly about mobile and digital health. This is a new area that I'm going to be putting a lot more emphasis on, and it's been really around kind of looking at the work that we've been doing in mental health, stress, isolation, addiction, in a way that all that's related, right? It's looking at the influences of society on mental health and stress, facilitators, things that have caused it, but also ways to use technology to improve and try to figure out what we can do to mitigate a lot of those issues. And the areas that we're looking at exploring is looking at better interventions. If you think about the health community right now in terms of what kind of interventions that they have, a lot of the stuff that we're doing just doesn't work. If you talk to our NIH colleagues or a lot of our collaborators in the health space, technology has a role it can play. One could argue that there's technology is actually playing a negative role in a lot of these things in terms of addiction and isolation, but how can we flip that a little bit and look at how do we use that as a way to reduce, to support mental health, to allow people to engage in these mental health support systems that are less stigmatizing, for example, that are actually accessible. And so there are some interesting research opportunities and things that we can do here. But part of this also we rely on the fact that we have to catalyze this community to get the right people to talk together, right? Computer scientists doing this on their own versus researchers in the medical space. Really, there actually is this combination that is required to actually have an impact here. So there's some things that we've already started in this space, but this is an area that we're focusing more on. The other thing that we're looking at is new funnels of getting help, right? You can argue that social media, social networks, search, and those kinds of things is causing isolation, but at the same time, how can we leverage those systems to get the people into the right places for help, right? So using social media to reduce the stigma, or social networks, but also as a way to funnel them to the right places. Search is a good example of this, right? If you think about the thing people jokingly talk about is Dr. Google, right? The first time you have an issue, you go to Google. Google's already doing this, right? One of the things that a team that I worked with at Google on is that if you go into incognito mode on your browser, type in some of the things that look like you're in a depressed state, the first thing that'll pop up is actually a hotline for calling in for somebody getting help. So it automatically prioritizes the hotline searches on top because it's predicting based on your searches. So there's a lot of different ways to actually get that funneling people to the right places to get help. And then the other thing is from a more of a sensor and kind of technology standpoint is identifying new biomarkers for indications for mental health. And a lot of times, physical and mental health it's always intertwined, right? It's not, you can't just separate the two. So physical isolation and mental health and physiological signals, all of those bring to bear in terms of what you can do as predictive signals for mental health. So looking at what are other biomarkers that are out there to be able to not just help people, but see if what the interventions are working or if they're not working. So these are the areas that we're exploring. These are pretty new. Some of the things that we're thinking about here are not just engaging with the computer science community, but with the health community, but also with some of the technology companies that are playing a role here, like Facebook, Google, et cetera. And so this is actually going to be an interesting opportunity for private-public partnerships that will start to push on in addition to kind of what you typically find in terms of funding some of this work. So this is kind of what we're looking at in the mobile and digital health area in this particular space. So Dan, you want to talk about intelligent infrastructure? Yeah.
Great. So Shwetak did a great job setting this up. And you saw a perfect example of the kind of brainstorming that leads to new areas and new ideas that could lead to new activities. This is catalyzing the research community, as Beth indicated, for audacious vision. So you can get a little bit of a nutshell from that. We've been working in intelligent infrastructure for a little bit longer. And if you trace back the history of this, it goes back to things that were called cyber-physical systems. So it goes back even longer than that. But I would put our finger on this maybe going back about 18 months or so. And Beth mentioned there have been a series of white papers, other activities certainly related to intelligent infrastructure that have been in some workshops, and we're still planning going forward on this. This is probably a version of a image that you've seen before. Some of you I know work in IoT, so you've seen this for sure. But this is a projected impact of IoT, Internet of Things, which is one example of intelligent infrastructure, the way it might be manifested out in the real world, showing the impact over 2025. We're talking about enormous amounts of money, economic impacts measured in the trillions of dollars. And you can see some other categories here that are certainly also in our wheelhouse. The automation of knowledge work is also in that same range. Mobile internet, cloud technology, advanced robotics is another example of intelligent infrastructure. Autonomous and near autonomous vehicles also way up there. Some other cool things, renewable energy, advanced materials, those are important too, but they're kind of tiny compared to the economic impact of the kind of stuff that we're working on. So this just is one indication of the importance of this. It's rolling out now, and when intelligence rolls into the physical environment, you've got the potential for all kinds of really cool things and all kinds of really scary things as well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And we're touching everywhere too. So we know computing is everywhere. This is a survey of industry executives in about 25 or 30 wildly different areas, saying, what is the importance of Internet of Things in your industry? Can you project this forward? And anything that is at least purple, anything going from here, going up to purple, is an indication of at least some importance, and massive importance is sort of these things. So the basic idea is all across the board, industry executives saying, yeah, this is going to be important. This is going to be important to us. Many of them are saying this is going to be really important. It's interesting that the one low point right here is state and local government. Right? A little bit reluctant or resistant to change, I suppose, but we can work on them as well. So this is hitting everywhere, right? So everyone is imagining this going forward, and think of IoT as a placeholder for intelligent infrastructure in many cases. So we know all of the rosy visions. We also know some of the potential negatives as well. So we love this cartoon. We used it in one of our white papers. And you can imagine an environment filled with intelligent devices all doing great things for you, but that could turn on you. This seems a little like science fiction, right? But I'm sure you're probably familiar with, there was a DDoS attack using IoT devices not too long ago. I'm sure you've read about the fatal crashes of Tesla and Uber cars, right? And this stuff happens, and then now it's basically in every headline in the country and in the world. So things that we as computer science experts might have been able to predict, of course there was going to be a fatal crash. We knew it. Gets exploded in the headlines, right? And something needs to be done about it. So that's sort of the point at which we find ourselves as experts in this field. And it's critical that we be aware of this and be in front of this and be part of the conversation. So you also probably are aware that I think the two biggest national security threats that we arguably face right now are election systems, voting systems, and also smart grid, right? So if you sort of see the red warning lights are blinking in those two areas, and that's intelligent infrastructure, right? So as Shweta mentioned, we've had an intelligent infrastructure task force, and Beth showed you some of the work that we've been doing so far. There are an enormous number of open questions here. Whether you think you're doing IoT or you're doing something else, it probably can be connected through maybe at most one hop to intelligent infrastructure in a very important, very fundamental way. And we need to be at the table here when these discussions take place and the research is actually performed. It touches everything: security, safety, usability, livability, health, equity, education, and jobs, right? Workforce is certainly very, very important, and Beth is going to talk about that. As I said, it connects basically to almost every CS research area I can think about, whether you're actually doing IoT research right now or not, or intelligent infrastructure research. Beth mentioned, I think better than I did, the resources that are available on the CCC website and things that we do. This stuff is rolling forward. It's not just a static thing that exists now, but these are things where if you see something interesting, you should reach out to us and let us know. This is a pretty big lift. It's not something that just 5 people can do, or 10 people can do, or 25 people can do. The community needs to be part of this conversation, part of this voice. As Beth mentioned, it doesn't have to be a single voice. It's not a single voice, but it is our voice as the experts helping the nation understand what's going on when it comes to intelligent infrastructure and what research needs to be done as well. So Beth mentioned the whole list of white papers that are available. That's, again, a static snapshot. This is a moving target, and we're constantly moving forward on it. We also had talks at AAAS. So you can actually see we're not just talking to our own small group. We're actually taking the show on the road. We did a congressional briefing, as Beth mentioned. We've been to AAAS. We ran a symposium here, and actually in this hotel. I think it was the first event done in this hotel when it opened last fall. It was our symposium. So yeah. Which is great. And going forward, there are a number of things going forward with the task force, one of which is going to be a collaboration between what we do and a big activity at NIST called the Global Cities Teams Challenge. This is going to connect us computing researchers more closely with the people where the rubber meets the road. So NIST Global Cities Teams Challenge typically are state and local leaders, municipal leaders, with specific problems they're trying to solve in smart communities and smart cities. And also a lot of the companies that are trying to help them implement those solutions. Not enough computing research, not enough computer science research. On the other hand, we're always looking for customers for our great ideas, right? So this looks like it might be a marriage made in heaven, and we're pursuing this as we go forward. So this is one of NSF's 10 big ideas. Shwedek indicated that, and Beth as well. There's going to be massive changes to the way we do things, including to the way we work, the way we learn, the way we interact with machine intelligence because of the physical implementations of intelligent infrastructure. So it is indeed the case that we are on the verge of inheriting the Earth, right? But that comes with a tremendous social responsibility as well. The social impact of what we're doing has never been bigger. We can't ignore that. And there's going to be social upheaval. There's going to be turmoil because of what happens. Certainly, we've seen this before in the history of civilization and society. This is not the first time there's been upheaval in employment, for example. But this time the finger is going to be pointed in our direction because we are the technologists that are implementing the technology that's going to cause this. So we're on the hook, so we need to be part of the discussion. We can't run away, we can't ignore it, and we can't run away from it either.
Thanks, Dan. I've learned a couple of interesting things already within this. One is, so we have a tradition in our library retreats, of doing slide karaoke. So you take 3 random PowerPoint slides and give them someone, and then they give a talk. And I have learned that if I mess up the ordering of the slides, Shwedek just like cruises right through.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I don't think anyone.
No, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have a new thing to add to that cartoon. So there is now a new form that's considered domestic abuse via Internet of Things. So people are terrorizing ex-spouses and partners, like turning on music and the lights in the middle of the night, turning off the air conditioning, which would be abuse in the South, turning the heat on in the middle of the night. And again, this is like, no one saw this coming. I'm like, this it really is integrated into everything we do. But should I? You want me to just go there? Okay. Sorry. Thank you. I forgot about the recording. But you now have, law offices and police departments now trying to understand what it means around ownership around domestic Internet of Things technologies. And there actually have been women that have been assigned to mental health facilities because no one believed them and they didn't understand how the technology was being controlled, and they thought they were going crazy, and other people agreed with them and instigated that particular process. So, we are inheriting the Earth in some really unexpected ways, and understanding kind of the controls and the mechanisms and the policies surrounding these technologies is going to be really important for us. Speaking of slide karaoke, I promised my colleagues I was going to talk about a few things, but then when I was writing the other talk, I kept thinking of things I wanted to add here. So apologies, but it's a little bit of a set of things that I wanted to touch on that I think all fit within the HTF portfolio one way or the other. So I mentioned the work in the previous talk about aging in place. This is my chance just to encourage folks to think of this from an extension of kind of the future of AI. This is a common technical diagram that's frequently used within our community, which basically translates to we have lots of different types of sensors, and somehow we have to perform the magic for how that can become assessments, inferences that then lead to, different types of frameworks. And what I mean by frameworks is then that has to be information that is assimilated by people who are not computing technologists, but they nevertheless need to understand and diagnose frailty or cognitive function or they want to provide facilities that support independence and quality of life, or they want to empower, for example, veterans as they go forward for their daily activities and engagement within the community. You know, this is the type of question that's being posed to our community to understand how to move this type of agenda forward. And once you have those types of frameworks, then there's a huge space in terms of the applications and use of these things. So Google Glass, no one tell Jim Foley I did that. Yes, Jim Foley is older adult wearing Google Glass. Telemedicine, the stove is unattended because safety is a huge issue in this space. A whole bunch of, I think, gleeful excitement about Alexa and different social agents, which is not really grounded in reality of what we know about voice interaction. So again, this is another conversation we need to wrestle to the ground. Tremendous capabilities in mobile health. This is personalized navigation for people who are aging with disabilities. So not just the fastest way to get there, but kind of the safest, the most accessible way to get there. And yes, I actually am working on augmented reality pool tables for people with mild cognitive impairment, and I can tell you over wine why that's a good idea. But you know, more and more about kind of the future of AI, and I wanted to pick up on some of the conversations that we've been having within the CCC. So stealing this from Thad Starner, who spoke at our symposium last fall, you know, we think this is just like, aha, AI is happening. And so he has a great discussion about, you know, 70 years of investment from, this is the infamous As We May Think article, to the technologies that we associate with Google Glass today. And what Thad posed to us, and I think this is going to be a continued and growing conversation that we really need to embrace within our community, is tackling that human AI combination in some really exciting and interesting ways. So what Thad wants to do is, you know, forget about AI trying to make sense of, you know, basic static properties of the world, integrate that directly into human perception, manipulation, and motion, and build that symbiosis from the ground up, very much as the original article discussed. And this is where I discovered things like Centaur chess. So the notion that the chess teams that are actually people-technology combinations beat both sides is a metaphor that we need to take out of just the chess domain and bring this to many other areas. But I think there's too much work being done on kind of the traditional problems within AI and machine learning, and it's going to require us to push the community forward into some of these perhaps more difficult challenges. I did promise that I would talk about the future of training and the future of work, and this is akin to the slide that Shwetak has already shown you. This is going to be a major area of NSF and other areas going forward, and it's really going to be incumbent on our community to give this teeth and to give this shape in terms of what this looks like. But if you imagine that kind of every aspect of, for example, this gets into Dan's infrastructure. Every aspect of maintaining and installing and making sense of infrastructure, whether it is those resistant city planners, or it actually even is the technology in the home for an aging adult. How do you make sense of this infrastructure, and how do you tie this in? So you can tell this is a bad image because it's a real image of an AR mixed reality system for welding. There's lots of fake, beautifully souped up images out there on the internet. But kind of the reality of what it means to live in these mixed reality worlds, both from a training perspective and from a job function perspective. My grand challenge that I've been mentioning over and over again at Georgia Tech, so they're tired of it, is just-in-time training for first responders. So imagine the cave rescue, right? What kind of like significant information did these people have to be able to assimilate to be able to collaboratively plan, and then to be able to execute that rescue in a very short period of time? How would you design a system that not only would convey that information, but would have to be authored as quickly as humanly possible to be able to accomplish that? And so that's the kind of questions that we're going to be looking at in an upcoming workshop next year for the CCC. But kind of this notion of the future of training within these kind of advanced modalities. But you don't have the luxury of, 3 years to build it. You need to build it within 2 days. I wanted to close on another topic, and I've got a couple folks here who attended this workshop. This is definitely another example of where we were looking in the health IT space, which I conveyed has been a decade of work within the CCC, but new conversations have emerged with this. And I think we're looking at this for the health angle, but I actually think it's relevant across the board in the kinds of things that we do. So a number of folks, and I'm not going to get all the names right, organized this workshop on socio-technical interventions for health disparity reduction. And it was a really cool workshop just from the design of bringing the computing, the HCI, and the IT people to Society for Behavioral Medicine, which happened to have a conference in New Orleans. Yay, we got to go to New Orleans. To pull those groups together. So again, kind of another thing from the CCC playbook is oftentimes the right people aren't meeting in the same places, and it's our job to kind of get them all together. But a couple things that I wanted to point to this. So first, and this is Tiffany Vigneault and another of other authors within this space, is looking at this for a model for intervention-generated inequality. And as a health IT person who's been working in this area for 20 years, I'd like to think of that I create technologies and that makes the world a better place. And one of the things that's hard for me, and I think we need to wrestle with this, is as we make these new information technology capabilities, we actually may be increasing disparity, increasing inequality because of the barriers that we are placing. And the simplest example, if you're familiar with patients like me, is, you know, if you went into that kind of site, like what kind of, do you really need to, like a college education to be able to make sense of and use that as a resource? But as our health world embraces these technologies, we may be leaving more and more people aside. So inequality in access, inequality in uptake in terms of how behavioral modifications, inequality in adherence as well, and inequality in effectiveness. So these are common issues for the healthcare world. I mean, we've heard about all the studies where everything in heart disease is, you know, white men over 50 or something like that. But we're now repeating those same mistakes with a technology footprint. And then, so this is the other version, and this is a paper that's hopefully going to be coming out soon, which is, I love the term leveling up. This notion of how do you take new IT approaches to decreasing healthcare disparities. And one of the things that we've learned from that first slide I showed you is things that are based on just changing an individual's behavior tends to increase disparities. And there's a whole textbook of why that's the case. But if you look at from a macro or meso perspective, in terms of shaping the context and shaping the environment where behaviors occur, you can actually reach the, you know, quote, those bottom tiers of the populations that you're trying to get to. But that requires a completely different of IT approach. So this paper is going to suggest ways for us to be able to try to accomplish that as a community. But that's a shaping question. It's moving our community from thinking of designing things just for individuals to use and designing technologies for different types of policymakers and people who are affecting living conditions and health systems and shaping technologies that would impact them as well. So I'm mentioning this because this is an ongoing conversation in the health part of this, but I think you could look at both of those two slides and think about education, think about workforce training, think about all the different ways that we are hoping that these technologies improve the individual condition, and we actually may be increasing disparities across the board and not even realizing that. And that's something that I would like our community to get ahead of instead of behind. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thoughts, reactions, questions? There's a microphone coming. There you go.
Thanks again, Tawana Dillon-Hunt, University of Michigan. So Beth, you kind of left off, I think, in your last talk, and again here with the inequalities.
Anne doesn't like me. She schedules me back to back.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Tiffany's work, but I'm also reading the book. It's called Automating Inequality. And I'm reading it. I haven't finished, but she cites examples from, government flaws or failures in deploying technology. And I know in the beginning you all talked about CCC's role in bringing, academics, citizens, government, together, and it made me think about the failures that could be coming out of government with computing. And the specific case she gave was trying to automate how people receive help poor people receive help, like welfare systems and algorithms determining, who gets what, and if there's a flaw in the algorithm, what the impact to people, could be. In some cases, it was death. And so I was shocked because I hadn't heard about this. It was just like these things are going on, the technology is being deployed or piloted in these, cities, and we don't hear about it. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts and reactions about what conversations are being had with. I don't even know how you would go about finding out how technology is being deployed and where those failures exist. I mean, the Affordable Care Act is another example where in the beginning people had a very hard time signing up for their health care. But it's a significant thing. So how does this come back to us, I guess?
Yeah, so I think, and you're better than me because right now it's just sitting in my Amazon cart to buy the book to read this.
You
so
should buy
you're
it.
ahead. It's on my list. But what I feel is that we're starting to observe these one-offs, and my sense of that notion of the need and the urgency, that we're at that cusp of really needing to come and embrace this topic in a holistic way, and that's why I like Tiffany and the work of her colleagues of doing this not in a sense of here's an example of just why this one system, but looking at this from a systematic approach. So I want to point to a couple of things, but then turn it back to y'all and say, sorry, it's a Southern thing, turn it back to everyone here, and 20 years, and argue for hearing from you to how we could take shape of this. So I learned a bunch of stuff also when I was doing the PCAST work around aging. And this is a huge area where we could be creating technologies that really exacerbate disparities. And some of that also matters in the articulation of the policy to the technology. And I don't think we can solve this with a technology-only approach. So one of the things that I learned is if you're an older adult and you need a wheelchair, you live in completely different worlds, whether you're on Medicaid, Medicare, or you're through the VA. Because the policy requirement on Medicaid, Medicare is that this is a medical necessity. So it is like, being prescribed a medication. You don't die, right? And actually a lot of doctors will over-prescribe or over-diagnose because the basic minimum is essentially bed to bathroom to kitchen. So no meaningful quality of life, and actually wheelchairs that then would create long-term physical impairments just based on how they're structured. The VA requirement for what reimbursement should accomplish is meaningful engagement with the community. And that is a night and day difference. Those are wheelchairs that have 24 hours of battery life. Those are wheelchairs that get you onto the bus. Those are wheelchairs that allow you to go out and hold jobs and engage. So we can design technology all day long, but if we don't also do this engagement around the stakeholders of the policy, these people are not going to get access to these capabilities because we don't have a system that supports that. So as we're looking at all of these issues around diagnosis, we know that predicting recidivism in criminal courts has huge bias that's increasing disparities based on how the algorithms are constructed. So that's another area. So I want to call out Lauren and others that have been involved with this effort that's actually come out of the Future Computing Academy, which has, I think there's a rather somewhat controversial article that's out there, or a blog post, that has said that, someone asked us earlier today about what are those broader impact statements that we write, and it's like, well, our world will make the world a better place, right? Shouldn't we have a little bit more rigor around what we ask of our field in terms of when we're actually thinking about the broader impacts? Because we need to create the tools that help people understand how you can actually make things worse. And you have to structure it in a way, because I've taught so many students and they're just like, I'm throwing up my hands, unintended consequences, I can't predict, I'm just not going to think about it. So we have to get past that I'm just not going to think about it mentality and give people the tools and the structures. But boy, that's a part of computer science curriculum I've never seen before. So how do we bring our field in that direction? So very long answer to your question.
And I'm actually going to piggyback on that for a second, because there was a part of the question that was, where does CRA-CCC kind of help in that interim? And so I'm going to throw something out, because this is also through the Future of ACM Academy Fellows and recently the Future of Life Institute I believe, came out with a statement on we need everyone to sign this to say that we will, our community as a field will not work towards creating automated weapons. Autonomous weapons. However, at the same time, someone in my office had a conversation with a program manager at DARPA. All he wants to do is make autonomous weapons. And with no care or concern for the other people's broader perspective, and it's the unintended consequences, everything. Well, we drilled down a bit further in the conversation, and he's, well, aren't you aware of the other consequences, so forth? He said, realize I come from the Army. I answer to parents, and they want to make sure that their kids are coming home. So I think it's really hard for us to sit here and say we're going to make decision A or decision B, and I think the role that the CCC and CRA can help play with the broader community is making sure that everyone sees as many sides as possible, and which is why we don't make policy, we help inform policy. We help bring in the right technology people to help the policymakers make the decisions and hope that we can get everyone at the table. That's why at a lot of our visioning workshops, we have philosophers, we have lawyers, we have anthropologists, we have different people so that the right opinions are coming out and we're not just sitting in our echo chamber, because as soon as we realized where that guy was coming from at DARPA, it kind of made sense. I'm not saying we're jumping on one side or the other, but we do have to realize that there are always different pieces coming at it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Amanda, and I've seen a lot of hands.
Thanks. So Amanda Lazar, University of Maryland. This is kind of far out maybe, but I'm curious about what the role of computing is in terms of attitudes and changing attitudes, because I think a lot of inequity might come from attitudes towards certain marginalized groups, and they shape the ways that we create technologies, they shape the ways that people receive technologies, and also kind of the larger picture of our world. And I think of attitudes and shaping attitudes. We know that media and technology shapes our attitudes, right? I mean, we could look at elections, all kinds of things, but I think of that as typically something that like media studies would look at. So do you see, does that fit within this vision? And I think it can be a bit tricky, right? Because do we know the attitudes people should be having, right, and how to push them there? But there's also things like we could, attitudes towards people with dementia. There's scales that we can assess, and I think those are kind of safer places. So.
I can give a couple examples that I think mental health would really come into this, Shweta, as well.
Yep.
So I really like Betsy DeSalvo's work at Georgia Tech as a couple of other examples in the space. And so, for example, she's looked at the use of technology by Hispanic parents, and then she's also looked at the use of technology around African American families, both relatively lower SES, and the mismatch between what these parents are trying to achieve and what the technology allows them to achieve. And there's just some basic examples, like if I'm looking for resources for my daughter searching for colleges, I will use a particular set of search terms that happen to actually work pretty well with respect to Google and how it indexes, and in ways that are not necessarily about attitudes, but definitely around media literacy. The equivalent African American parents will not be as successful in the way that they try to search for what will be equivalent material. And it's a literacy question, it's a media question, and with the Hispanic parents, we were also looking at questions around expectations of roles and relationships with teachers, which were very different culturally coming from the Hispanic community than the neighboring primary white community within the same neighborhoods. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a whole bunch of factors into what where people come to technology with respect to their expectations and literacy in a lot of different dimensions than we're used to thinking about, and where and how technology is designed that right now we don't see those mismatches as we're creating them. And so I think if we're looking at, and many of the things that we've seen within the CCC has not just been that computing folks should do this all by themselves, but if you want to be successful in, for example, technologies that increase access to educational resources or technology that helps people make informed healthcare decisions, here are the stakeholders and the populations that you need to bring to the table to be able to be successful. And we need to perhaps raise the bar with respect to what our community needs to accomplish if they're going to move into these areas. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think there is a sphere of influences that if you're working in this space, and I'm looking at Andrea and thinking about Katie, as well as Katie Seek's work, that said, if you're going to be working on technology that in your broader impact statement, for example, says you're going to improve the life of people who are disabled, and nowhere in your research plan are you actually working with people who are disabled, maybe we should look at that mismatch, right? Because what we think is just early work to get the technology working is actually making a whole set of design decisions and things that are built into that structure that are closing all the paths for different populations. And we need to address that in that upstream way.
Yep. And the one thing I would add is that, often when you engage with either the media or people in another community outside of computer science, one of the things that they often realize is that we can help build tools that they never thought were possible to build to help them with. And so I think so Kate Starbird's example is a great one, where using the technology that's being used to, as a tool itself, and there's signals there that she can use to be able to identify different things that are going on, but these are tools that we often didn't really think about, right? Or even tools to identify when a video is fake or it's a real video and those kinds of things, right? And as computer scientists, we kind of created this problem, so we have to figure out how to undo this. I think that was a statement we said many times at our latest council meeting, was that I think we have to have a seat at the table, and it's our since we created a lot of these technologies, we are probably in the best position to figure out what are the ways that we can mitigate a lot of those things. But I think tools is another one, is that we can help build those systems to kind of facilitate the things that the other communities are working on or need to do.
Just one little quick additional response that builds on what Beth and Schmidt said. So these systems, and machine learning systems, they're built, they're optimized, they're fine-tuned for the majority case, right? That's the best performance. That's what they get fine-tuned for. And economically, there's a tremendous incentive that pushes that in a direction. That's a fundamental flaw with the way a lot of this stuff gets fielded and developed. But,
Hey, Joseph Osborne, Pomona College. So you said that there's no CS curriculum you know of around unintended consequences, but I feel like in engineering curricula, there is often a failures class, right? Structured around engineering failures. Do you think it's the position or the role of the CCC or maybe of SIG CSE or some other group who should get together with the ethicists and the privacy experts and whoever else to come up with that kind of model curriculum?
Yep, we actually had a great session on this at Snowbird. So this is where the chairs and the deans and folks get together. Barbara Gross from Harvard was one of the speakers there. And so the good thing is that people are working on these curriculum. And also learning from the implementation of that curriculum. Ironically, because school starts in 2 weeks and I'm so not prepared, because no one else feels that way. Yeah, I'm teaching the computing and ethics class it was a required class for all of the undergrads in computer science. And I haven't taught in a decade, which means that all my notes are pretty much useless, because a lot's happened in the past decade. And one of the things that was discussed in this Snowbird discussion was, first off, that one-shot classes aren't really effective, so I know going in that I'm probably not going to move the needle too much, but what we really need to be doing is building modules so that when you're taking algorithms or you're taking databases or you're taking networking, that we have that curriculum built in with respect to the professional obligation and oath. Because I started an engineering curriculum and I saw all those beautiful videos of the bridges tearing themselves apart. And so you actually not learn the techniques of what you can build, but also the techniques of what you shouldn't build, or how to think. As I said, I've just taught so many students where they're just like, okay, there's too much to think about, I'm just going to give up. And we have to get them out of that response and to give them the tools to start thinking about bias in different algorithms, as one example. So I think there is emotion there. But we need to amplify that because it's something that our folks aren't learning right now, and then they're just exacerbating these problems in our field.
So that those slides for snowboard are online. I don't know whether they're videos, but the slides are definitely online. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Lauren Wilcox. I just want to build on that a little bit. How do we incentivize, both culturally and in terms of integrating new academic curricula, how do we incentivize these kinds of systematic changes that can help the computing community understand the value of working with people like social scientists or philosophers, ethicists, right? Incorporate that kind of work into computing, directly into computing, because I think keeping it separate is very dangerous. So how do we as a field kind of embrace the challenge? And I don't know that we're going to get to an answer, but just kind of a, food for thought kind of a thing. What are some actionable things that we might be thinking about so that we can look at this systematically and not just, what we wish we could do in a class or, these smaller steps that ultimately might not have as much power?
Good question. I mean, one is, I think one of the issues is that we haven't had that conversation, so we haven't been able to identify, at the end of the day, for a computer scientist, it's what's the computer science research contributions, and there's a lot to be had there, but they haven't been identified. So I think one is, and as what we're doing this in the CCC is bring those communities together to be able to identify those research questions, right? So and the onus is actually on us too, as we think about how we mentor our graduate students to think about technology more holistically and how we define research contributions, and cutting across fields is an important way of showing that. I think a lot of times if it's not technical enough or it's not computer science, or it doesn't matter, right? It's a component, it's a tool that we're using to solve a broader problem. So a lot of it is around the mentorship of the next generation researchers and thinking about how we frame these problems for them, how they frame these problems, where these are important computing challenges, even though it might not be a pure computing problem. I think that's one way.
And so there's different levers that we have access to. So I think CCC focuses on the research visioning, and we have to kind of make sure we don't try to boil the ocean. CRA as a whole, I think, is going to continue to pick up and push on this curricula notion, and Barbara was looking especially harried at the end of that particular session because everybody wanted her stuff immediately. But I think this notion of how do we have kind of open curriculum with these modules that could drop into CS and computing classes could be a huge resource for our field as a whole. So I think that's where that's moving. She just said I'm not allowed to bug her in the next few weeks on that, but it is coming. What I would like to see with the research visioning, which is where we sit, is, as I said, to give people kind of the tools and the framing and the shaping of this to start to open up or describe that space. So, when we did the health IT work, it was really clear, and, NIH and big bags of money were sitting at the table, but it was about, computer scientists want to do this work without talking to physicians? Right? Like, why would why would that count? Why would we ever favorably review that, right? If you want to move the needle here, you need to have real clinical healthcare, some type of partners, and that's how that's reviewed. The new smart and connected community solicitation, same thing. You want to work in this space, here's what here are the real requirements for having a community partner. Now, it's way too engineering focused for my taste, but nevertheless, it was a real partnership requirement. Picking on Greg Hager, who's sitting in the back, the robotics community has had to deal with this for a long time because they've come at it from an engineering perspective, and not killing people with the robot, not counting Ann's comment about DARPA, was part of it, right? Physical safety really mattered. So it can be baked into different areas, but for example, on the algorithmic machine learning data side, and they're having that conversation next door, it's not baked in yet, right? And in many of our other places that we're working, we haven't figured out how to bake that into the research community. But I think we can, but it's really important to give people kind of the tools and the frameworks to do it. And then we all gang up on each other at the panel review sessions and say, no, this doesn't get funded because it's not kind of going that extra mile that's needed. So we changed the goal line.
Well, these seem a bit like also meta discussions where CCC is ideally placed. You can just imagine the following example. So you're aware of the controversy around Amazon's facial recognition technology, been in the paper, like all over the papers. Can you imagine that technical work being presented at a computer vision conference and someone raising the question saying, how could this be abused? That's not the kind of question that typically comes up and the technical conference, but it would have been very nice if that had been discussed beforehand, because if it was discussed beforehand, I think some of the issues could have,
Yep.
problems could have been addressed beforehand. But
Yep. I am also sensitive to time too, so we're at 3:30. So we'll take one more question, and then I think we have a break next.
Lauren, is there next steps to?
So I'm actually publishing, I'm like just a couple days away from publishing a follow-up blog post that summarizes all the feedback we got based on the initial post. So some really interesting things to think through. We're also planning a workshop. And that workshop is going to be kind of thinking through what would it practically entail to start incorporating more discussion of negative impact into peer review. There's a lot of open questions, though, about how to go about that. Some of it will be practical, and then some of it will be visioning. So looking at this also as a computing research agenda. How do we incorporate ideas that help us study and research, as computing research, what negative impact means, and really start tackling it. So there's a post coming soon, and then probably a few follow-up workshops. There's definitely one that will be happening in the fall in Chicago, and then we'll hopefully be building on that as well.
Yeah, and so I just want to build a couple things. So, this is sponsored by the NSF, right?
Yeah.
So this is, NSF willingly going there in this and enthusiastically. And since I always go too far when I'm talking, and Anne's not here to correct me, I want to be really clear that what CCC does is around the shaping of the research visions, right? So the content and the approach and the barriers. We don't go into policy. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are informed by CCC activities then can engage in other policy discussions. So when I talked about learning from CCC about aging and then participating in a PCAST study where we explicitly were told to look at policy, I got to leverage everything that the CCC had done, but I was in an appropriate policy setting, or actually policy advising community. So those swim lanes matter a little bit in terms of what we can do, but I think we can go a long way in terms of articulating a vision and barriers and goals of our community, and then opening up lots of different doors. For example, we would never get into how NSF should review, but nevertheless, everyone who is involved in those discussions is probably an NSF reviewer, so they're going to be informed and think about things in new ways. So they do infect each other, but there's things that we officially do, and there's things where we're trying to just move the community forward.
Great.
I think I made that clear as
Yeah,
mud.
yeah,
Yep.
I think
Okay.
it's right. Yep, good job. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.